Well, hello there, Sheila. Welcome to the Attachment Theory and Action podcast. I am so thrilled to be in conversation with you today because I always learn so much in your presence. And I know our listeners and viewers will too. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Jenna. I'm very excited to be here. I always love to talk about my interest. It's like I feel really lucky. We talk about sometimes with individuals who are neurodiverse that they have a special interest and, they're kind of very focused on it. And this is mine. So to me, it always feels like such a pleasure to be invited to come and share the things that I'm also very excited about and the work that I'm doing and others are doing collectively that's making, I think, a big difference for kids and adults in the world. So thanks for inviting me.
Yes, I know it is. And maybe that's where this hyper focus really has paid off, because that's why I wanted to invite you as a guest. I met you years ago at an Attach conference. I had never heard of you or your work and just wanted to learn more about sensory integration. And you were doing a double session. And I was like, I'll just go to the first one and check it out. And of course, I had to stay for the second one. And now I've gone on to see you at other conferences as well, because my mind was blown, literally. I mean, you had your passion and your knowledge and your wisdom around sensory integration, and especially how that applies to children who have had developmental trauma and attachment ruptures. Was so helpful and impactful. So I'm so excited to get into more of that with our audience today. But before we do, I'm kind of finding my own ritual as still a newer host to the podcast. And so I've been starting off with this question to bring more of who you are into the interview, which is the core of that is always those attachment and somatic memories that are part of us. And I would invite you to please share an attachment memory that feels important to you and especially your work and why you do the work.
Well, when I think about why I got interested, particularly in sensory integration, and I feel like I have a really deep innate understanding of how it relates to how you feel about yourself as a person, your competency, and really how you feel safe in relationship to another. Just because as a child, I had my own sensory integrative challenges, and, they don't go away. It's your unique wiring. And how I was wired, it was influenced by being born early so being 4 weeks premature, we now know that has an impact on the cerebellum and gets into the vestibular processing, which is really where I was really driven to learn more. But anyway, I really was fearful of movement and didn't understand my body and space so very well. So, for me, going on a swing, I would do it. But when it would go too high, it was a bit terrifying. And I could go up of a slide and go down it, but I was more tentative than everyone else, which, has an impact on how you feel about yourself as a child on the playground when no one else has a problem. But it was as that sort of sense of feeling safe in space really impacts your movement. And so, I understand more now why, but I can remember there was a small, I must have been 3 and 4. And at the end of our street was a school and there was a small bike rack. It was just a bar like this. And it couldn't have been more than a couple of feet off the ground. And kids would go and they would turn themselves upside down on it. And for me, I would look at that. And it was terrifying to begin with. And the other part of it is not only the fear of movement, but I now know the vestibular system informs and lets you have kind of a basic map of your body and where it is in space so you can move in any direction and you know how to move. I couldn't figure out how they were doing it. So it started to, have an issue with sometimes for me, confidence. And also, as a child, when you can't do something, you take on that I can't do a lot of things. And so when we talk about particularly in trauma agency, like I can do it, like that for me, when I am with a child and they say they can't. I just had this 2 weeks ago. I had a little boy come in and I have a big sheet of stretchy Lycra, and it's like woven in, not woven, but layered, and you climb it and it takes your body down, it bounces. And most kids come in and look at it and cannot wait to get in it. And he came in the door, and I always like to get kids to be comfortable with the space before we do anything. And he ran in and saw the room, which looks inviting in this contraption kind of. And I said, we can climb it. And he said, oh, I can't climb. And I was like, oh, that for me was that heartbreaking feeling of, I can't do that. That I can't do it is really, I can do it as agency. And that physical sense that you can master things in the environment relates so much to our emotional confidence as a child. Also, and so anyway, with that young man at the end, he was doing it. He was so excited. And then he was taking challenges. And to me, that's really the art of sensory integration, and how he felt about himself, and his whole presence changed. A lot more happened in there, but to me, that's like the most key ingredient is the I can do it. And I didn't really get to that till later in life, because those challenges for me did bleed into Ayer's original theory was about sensory integration and learning, some learning challenges. I have been diagnosed with dyslexia. It never showed up at school in a way that was, I was never identified with any problems, but I always felt less than, and I didn't think that I was very bright. And I can remember my father was a teacher telling me, and I'd say, Dad, is there something wrong with me? It seems like this is harder for me. And he'd say, no, you're so smart. Don't worry about it. So even there you can see emotionally that brings it up for me, and how important it is for kids to feel that, how they can do it, how they can conquer things, they can master things. It would bleed into friendships, because when, you're playing a game, kids, at some point do want to win. It's important to win and lose is part of our own system of feeling safe. Like if I can win at tag means I can escape something. And we don't look at those games in that way, but that your own ability to take care of yourself is really bound up in your body sense of yourself, which is really goes back to that vestibular, that inner ear sense that most people equate and say, oh, if we talk about the inner ear, we're talking about balance. And it's so much more complex than that. And I think that my understanding of that and its interrelationship with all of the other senses was driven from my own challenges and my own sense. And the other thing that drives the passions in what I do is I do everything on myself. And I feel how that changes, not just coordination or focus and attention, but my ability to feel safe and secure in relationships and my ability to take challenges in the world. So for me, a lot of what I'm teaching comes from that innate, my learning. And I think some of our, what they say is some of your strengths are also your weaknesses, or some of your weaknesses are also your greatest strengths. Like that wiring allowed me to look at things differently, have an innate understanding, to then be able to, when I read something or read one part of science that illuminated it, that it just was like a rich knowing for me. And then being able to take that, I feel like that's been my whole work, take that into the clinic and see it applied to other kids. So.
Yes. And thank you for letting that emotion come out in that story, because I could already feel it there, because it when you don't have that integrated felt sense of who you are, your body, your own agency, it does impact our, in an attachment language, our internal working model. And yours was very much, I can't, or I'm scared, right, and other people can do this. And you mentioned that you helped this little boy kind of find his agency, and that you also had a cheerleader with your dad. As you reflect on your experience and what that was like for you as a child, was it your dad, or did you have someone that you were able to figure some of this out relationally?
Yeah, I think if I go back to, important key attachment figures, my father would be one of them, because another thing that he did, so there's you can do it, but it wasn't just that. It's like he delighted in my intellect. And when I think I have unique ways of sometimes expressing myself that give people a felt sense. And I think that's a gift, but it also can get in the way because it's challenging to write from that perspective. But I would say something from my unique perspective, and he would just light up that delight in my uniqueness. And I think that's a key ingredient that allowed me to then step out, even though I was scared. Do you know what I mean? Even though I was worried, even though I was anxious sometimes. And I also seem to be able to figure out how to navigate towards friends that pushed me. Like I had one friend and she was trying to get me to be, I don't even know where she got this tote and chip card that you get when you're camping. And like, you're going to climb this fence, you're going to climb this tree, and then like, you can, like cheerleading for me.
Yes.
And we're going to toughen you up. You're just too soft, a little bit of an army approach, but, in a way where it was, I wanted to join in and be in relationship. I wanted to play, so just seeing that influence, it was in relationship. It wasn't just like, oh, well, I just rolled down a bunch of hills and, did these things and I got my body organized. It was all in relationship. And I think that's part of the encouragement, the seeing where someone's at, the seeing where they can go. And I think that most important ingredient is really just the delight in the uniqueness of each individual. And I think that's one of the key things. And really bringing that into relationship when you're with kids, for really seeing them for who they are and not seeing them for what they can do.
Yeah,
really seeing what they can do and what's unique and what's really special about them is the piece that I think my friends saw in me. And that definitely my father and I think other really key relatives in my attachment history. It's interesting that it's not my mother. And I think that I was very different from her and she didn't really quite understand me. And I think that I think that led to some other attachment challenges for me. But, you need one good caregiver. It doesn't have to be your mother, but I think people think of attachment in mothers sometimes, but I think we know differently now. So, but other relatives, and I think my father's side of the family is very creative artistically with language. And I think all of my other relatives on his side of the family delighted in that in me and brought that forward. And also my whole father's side of the family were teachers and delighted in explaining and telling the story and, really describing things in detail and colorful ways. And, we like word usage, like, oh, that's a great word, So I think was a big influence for me.
And, I recently interviewed Circle of Security folks, Glenn Cooper and Deidre Quinlan, and so much of the circle, one of the core attachment ingredients is about delighting in your child. There's no contingencies. It's not because you performed well. It's because just that genuine delight of who you are and your uniqueness. And so we've already got a beautiful takeaway for our listeners in delight, remembering to delight in the children that we work with or care for or parent or teach, because we are all wired so uniquely in our experiences and our whether those are adverse or positive, are part of our makeup and our unique sensory integration and the way we know ourselves. So thank you for sharing that. And so it's probably no accident, it never is, that you became an OT.
No accident.
And so just to give us all a better baseline understanding, because we talk about sensory and kind of use different terms interchangeably, sensory integration, sensory processing, regulation. Can you, especially how you interpret it, so that as we go along in this interview, our listeners will have a shared understanding of the language?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of boxing that's done in the world. And I know that that's a place that people go to learn things where they put things in specific boxes. And so if you did just do an internet search on sensory processing, the bulk of what I think you would find is that people talking about over and under responding to sensation. That's not where I started at all. I started studying sensory integration when I was still in my OT program. I was really fortunate enough to have a presentation. I was in Ypsilanti, Michigan, but the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor is its neighboring town, much well known. And obviously that's where I met my husband and married him. So, I have a strong attachment to University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan. But I went to see Lorna Jean King, who was actually doing sensory integration in mental health, but with autism as a student. And it was a professional continuing ed course. And I'm like, this is like what I want to do. And I didn't mean I wanted to be on stage teaching, but that's exactly what I ended up doing. I meant I wanted to work from a sensory integrative perspective. So the minute I was out, I was trying to drive toward all my continuing ed was in Dr. Jean Eyre's work of sensory integration. And she used the term sensory processing and sensory integration, but she used that like a combined sentence. She never really looked at the senses individually, except that she did talk and she coined the term tactile defensiveness, which is when you're over responsive to touch. And she said, and in these same kids, we notice hyperactivity. So she really laid the foundation for reacting to sensation and arousal, or physiological arousal and state regulation. I mean, the grains of it. She said, but they often are also sound sensitive and can be olfactory sensitive, so sensitive to smells. Mm-hmm. So she coined that term, and then she coined a term, gravitational insecurity. And that's really what drew me in, because I was that gravitationally insecure child. If I moved my head out of the upright, I didn't know where my body was in space. That is the very definition of gravitational insecurity. And that was that slight hesitation when the swing went too high or coming down the slide. And if the slide was too high, I'd be a little hesitant going out of it, down it. So that whole gamut of how you respond to sensation, do you over or under respond? We do have kids, I'm not an under responder, but who may need more information to be able to get the system going. So that whole thing is termed sensory modulation now, but people are talking about it in the field of sensory integration. But it overlaps with what in the term now in the field of sensory integration, people talk about a sensory discrimination. But I really see a key part of that. That's really how we build our perception of our body and space and know where we've been touched, and to be able to build all of that, those perceptual skills around visual perception. That all falls into more that discriminative level. So that integration, she really looked at the senses and how they all worked together. And the key to her work was that she was unique in bringing forth the vestibular system, because OTs at the time she came into her work were working on visual perception, but she was really talking about how key the body senses were, both the vestibular and the tactile proprioceptive senses were to overall perception. She talked about visual perception, but then it really led her to talk about body and space. Knowing where we were at any point in time in the space and exactly what was going on around us was a key factor that she talked about. But then as you learned and moved, and another key thing in there about the vestibular system was, and you developed the ability to come up against gravity and challenge gravity and master your environment, all of your other perception shifted. So that was, there's so much in there and so many key disorders that she talked about, but she really brought to light the key piece as the vestibular system as an integrator. And that without knowing where you are in the field of gravity, which is the key reference point, she said, and that's a force that's constantly, it's present, it's ongoing. We don't escape gravity unless we go into space, which some people are doing now. But that really is the key tie point. And then also knowing which direction I'm going. Without that, none of the other senses make sense. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to me now is that we're seeing that the vestibular sense is also impacted in trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of those things, and it's so big. It's really about our most basic sense of self. That's what people are finding, that our physical, emotional sense of ourself on the most basic level is tied to that. It's tied to processing in the brain that ties to the insula, which is for emotional regulation. And where it ties together with the insula kind of oversects in the brain with where we map out our body and space in that sensory motor homunculus that everybody may or may not know, depending if you study neuro, which is fascinating to me. I have a body, it's here in space, and it feels like this. That information is only going to be accurate if you have good vestibular processing. We know that that leads to sensory integrative developmental issues. That's me. I came by it probably in my DNA and in my being born early and other influences. And we know it's disrupted in adults with trauma.
Yes. So that's a great way to interject more around trauma, and how I know it sounds like you kind of started on a more traditional OT path, but then how did you start to piece together just the very important connection between trauma and attachment issues, and how that also overlays with these sensory integration challenges, and especially in regards to the vestibular system, because that's what really blew my mind when I heard you speak. I remember you saying, we're all so reliant on GPS now. I don't know how I ever drove or got anywhere without GPS. I did somehow, but if I'm driving somewhere and my GPS goes offline, it's so disorienting. And my stress response system often goes into this fight or flight response. Like I'm lost, I'm never going to find where I'm going. So yeah, talk to us more about trauma and the vestibular system.
Well, and I think I love that you said your GPS. So that there is that GPS of I am. That's the very basic ingredient. And the vestibular, you asked me how I got there. It's interesting because back in 1980, when I graduated, the jobs for, if you wanted to be a pediatric OT, was like this highly coveted position, at least in Michigan, and you couldn't get in unless you had experience. Well, that, means that you take a different route. So I did my first work. I worked in mental health, and I worked in a day treatment center for, that was being fed by it was a time of deinstitutionalization in Michigan. And so it was being fed by a lot of individuals coming for day treatment out of group homes, but also we were attached to an acute care facility with a psychiatric unit, and those individuals would come down into our programs as well. And so I was just going to do sensory integration, because if Lorna Jean King did it with autism, and there were some other people, Karen Pettit and Elaine Utley, were doing vestibular work in psychiatry, which very much relates to trauma, because we know disorganized attachment leads to many of those issues. Now I know that. I didn't know that at the time, but I was doing sensory integration. I was focusing on vestibular input and organizing the body and space and that very thing. And I had adults. We had a full-size trampoline, which was wonderful. I found a ramp in between the hospital and our day treatment, and I had scooter boards that we were going down, and we were rotating. It sounds crazy, adults in office chairs, but interestingly enough, I did a presentation at AOTA that year, and it was super well attended. And one of the things that I did, so we're going back to 1980, we didn't have the assessments or the information we have now, but I did pre and post draw person and showed changes, which is that really draw person is really a composite of not only your felt sense of your body and space, but also a developmental level. You can look at it that way, but you can also look at it emotionally as well. But I remember, and I was thinking about this just in terms of knowing we were going to do this podcast, but thinking back about one of my clients, Alice, actually thought she was shrinking. And we now know this minimal sense that I have a body, this is mine, and this is the size and shape of it, comes from the vestibular system. And she made some really significant changes in, her drawing and in her being settled in her body form in that time period. I don't know that other people recognized it, but I tracked it in my way of looking at it at that point in time. I don't think I really got how related that was to the vestibular piece until now. The other thing that I remember was I did records reviews on a lot of my clients, and a lot of them that were in day treatment had early special education and had early challenges and, had challenges with learning growing up. And one of the things we know about developmental trauma is that it shifts the chemistry and that it creates a brain chemistry that actually kind of prunes or kills some of the connections in the white matter, which is all of those integrating fibers. We also know that you can grow them, so it's not all negative. But it's just interesting to me that I was on that path. I don't think I clearly understood what I was doing then, but intuitively I was on the path. And then I actually went into adult rehab, neuro rehab, where my passion for studying the brain and perception has always been there. And that kind of fueled that. And then finally, after about 5 years of work in neuro rehab, I was back in the schools and working with kids and got my SI certification and did it in its classic format for, kids with learning challenges, et cetera. And then I, eventually had a private SI clinic, but a lot of individuals that I served were in the foster care system here in Madison. And so I started to enter into it and working with kids who were in foster care, who had sensory integrative challenges. And so that was really my bridge into that and seeing the possibilities for, really improvement in their daily life, in their connection and relationships with others, in working from that sensory integrative perspective.
So Alice, who you mentioned, felt like her body was shrinking and had these body challenges. Did she also have a history of trauma and attachment issues?
I don't know that now because that was back in 1980. And I think back then, if I can take you back there from my perspective, we thought mental health, pediatrics, physical disabilities. But now I really see being trauma informed really changed the lens of how I see things. So I think that would be really interesting to know. My guess is yes, but I'd only be guessing. But if we fast forward, I could a current case that I'm working with is a young man, a kind of preteen with several mental health acute hospitalizations, really incredible family, a history of having some neurodiversity and other challenges, but super sound sensitive where you couldn't be out in the world without wearing ear muffling headphones. And that was really the reason why they came to us and how, the sound of just the kitchen faucet and it's certain sounds that family members made and made sitting at dinner table really just almost impossible. It was the referral concern. But let's tie that back to this integrator of the vestibular system. I wanted to do a really most basic balance response with him to get him to feel his body. And it was really a very simple thing where we laid down on a foam roller and you kind of just roll till you catch yourself in the balance. And he immediately fell off and said, I just can't trust my body. And really, that was very related to when you do that, if you were to lay down on a foam roller and you sort of are not hanging on and you slowly roll to a side, you'll feel that your vestibular system says, hey, you've moved off center, and it will talk to muscles in your body that will pull it back. And I just thought sometimes our clients say it so clearly, but we might miss that. And just imagine how that contributes. I don't trust my body. My body doesn't work for me. Yes. Again, how that relates back to, not feeling. And for him, it was a big part of not feeling a part of the group. And the kids didn't like him and other, sensory processing challenges that were going on. Now, I don't know that was all of it, that, there were other components in there, not necessarily developmental trauma, but I see sometimes how the sensory processing piece can impact your sense of yourself that creates its own, mental health issues within the, within your life.
Yes. So to kind of bring this all together, so the vestibular system, because even that you explained, these real life examples, that was very helpful, and in your own experience growing up. But I guess a good way to summarize that is it's really our body's internal GPS that helps us with body awareness, where our body is in space and time. And especially if there's trauma and attachment concerns, that it, and some of these might be very adaptive, very wise things that our body did, that our body does instinctively to protect ourselves. Like maybe we do have to tune out from our bodily sensations, right, because we have to be more alert to what is going on in the environment around us and scanning for cues of danger. And so then we become more disconnected from that internal wisdom. And it would make sense why this boy might not trust his body. And so your work, in doing sensory integration from that trauma-informed, attachment-informed place, is taking all those pieces of the story and how do we help better integrate and help him learn to then trust his body?
Exactly. And to do things that are, the other thing is that was regulatory for him. Interestingly enough, we did address the sound issue, but we didn't address it until we were probably a couple months into treatment. And one of the things that he did to regulate when he was in here and that he found was we introduced the activity of being on a swing that you kind of lay on top of, and then we twist it and you spin. And once it gets twisted up, it unspins and then drops. And then that ability to hang on. And when we did that the first time, he completely lit up. And it was interesting because I would say before that, sometimes we would ask him something or make a comment and he just wasn't present in the room. Like there was no response. But and he chose to spin and spin and spin and spin. And he probably stayed on that for about 20 minutes. And the more he spun, the more present he got. The spinning I wouldn't do that with everyone. That was really led by him, but is what kind of one of the most powerful vestibular inputs. And so we did create a program that wasn't that went home. And we used really precise vestibular activation through spinning in multiple positions. And it was well within we're not even talking about him tolerating it. He loved it. And I remember we lent them a rotary board and they took it home. And I remember a couple months later, Dad was bringing it back and he said, we asked family support to get us one of these because this is the most regulating thing that he has ever done. And when he gets that in there, his day is so much better. So when you think about, to me, that's a key piece that I think people don't understand. I think people in the OT world get a little afraid of spinning because if somebody is overly sensitive, they would get really sick with that input, right? And that would cause a real negative thing. So it's not something we would ever force on individual. But the vestibular system, the thing that it does is when you feel your body, it brings you into the present moment. It's mindfulness. Play is mindfulness for kids and finding that place where you click into your body. And it's not just your body, it's your body in time and space, which is your body in the present moment. The vestibular sense is all about that. And I know you asked another part to this question, but can I just go on and just talk about a completely different case that would be much more about a trauma background and how vestibular played in there?
Sure, yes.
Because I think it's not just, so in this case, this was a developmental difference in this young man that led to other complicating factors where it wasn't just that. There were other things that were in the picture. This is just what I'm looking at. But I was treating a young man who was lived in his family in another country that with his mother, but in a very, 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 very poor, she wasn't able to really care for them and adopted into an orphanage at a later age, like 6 or 7, not an early adoption. So had, an impoverished beginning economically and probably in terms of safety, and then was brought to the US, I think somewhere around the age of 10. And I was seeing him at 16. And nobody'd say he had a vestibular challenge. I mean, he was in sports at a really high level, but on the days that he would, and he was, we were seeing him from a trauma perspective, he was doing some self-harm. So that tells you now I'm doing, as you said, sometimes the brain just cuts off feeling from the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's too painful to feel your feelings. And that's a smart choice that your brain makes for you. But when it does that, it cuts off your awareness also from the present moment. And we know that because you're not think about yoga. Yoga is about being in the here and now, being mindful, being with yourself. But what we would do with him, we also used rotary input, but then we would do balance challenges. And this is something that I think all of us can do to practice mindfulness. If you have trouble quieting your mind, if you're at a high level, get a slack line. For him, he was at a high level. He would come in, we would do the rotary component of what would be a protocol we call astronaut training. And then he would get up on a big gym ball, a big one, like he was high off the floor. He was so talented. We had to challenge him. And so he would use this oscillating blade called a body blade, or we would throw things to him from all different angles to bring him into the present moment, to be able to start our session and to use those components as a way for him to come to the present moment. We also use sound with him as well. But so you can play that vestibular piece a lot of ways. And what we know, and he would be approaching more adults with, that history of developmental trauma. And he was doing some of that, shutting off feeling. So we're using the vestibular system to bring basically the insula back online, which is, not only our feelings, our emotions, but also our, is a feeling good or bad? And I think he was getting that mixed up with he was actually doing cutting. And so he was just feeling to feel something. So using the vestibular piece to pull that back online for him. And then putting in components of that to his home program. And he was, very cognitively able to learn how to manage some of those things on his own, how to use we use a sound tool as well that gets into the vestibular system, but also helps to regulate and bring you to a place of more centered, more calm and alert, if you will, if you want to use those words. But, and he was then just teaching him how to use those tools for himself.
Yeah, that's another rich example. And I also teach yoga. And no accident that I ended up in yoga because I think it was so powerful in my own healing journey. And so I will often tell my students when we're doing balance, you really can't help but be present and more connected to what's going on in your body as you're working on these more challenging experiences where you're figuring out where your body is in space and time. So, which also leads me to, I think something else our listeners and viewers will find very interesting is when I saw you speak later at another conference, I think it was a different attached conference, and you introduced us to Dr. David Berceli's work in tension and trauma releasing exercises. And it was, and I'll let you define that more for us, but it really opened my mind up once again to the way our body stores trauma and attachment memories, and that we also then need a way to discharge and release that. And so do you want to tell us more about your work with TRE is the acronym we use for tension and trauma releasing exercises, and how you've used that in your work?
Yeah. So I kind of came into it. I fell into it really kind of for my own particular purposes, but a therapist was talking to me, and she knew me as an OT, about how I might find David Berceli's work interesting, and that they were doing a workshop in town this weekend because it was body-based, and she knew that was kind of my background. And it was a therapist friend. What she didn't know is I had recently had some life-changing experiences that, I was really struggling to cope with. And that was in my own state of, I would call it a little T, one of those life experiences that it just was taking you, life adjustment, if you will. So not a really big trauma. So it was particularly interesting. But when I got there into the workshop, it was like, oh, this is exactly what I know. Wait, you twisted it a little in terms of, and that was where I hit the intersection of sensory integration and trauma. And really, and my eyes got wide open. And then I could dial back to all those things I did in the past and see it through a different lens. But David Berceli's work is really interesting. He's a wonderful clinician and teacher, and he developed a tool called trauma intention releasing exercises. It used to be called neurogenic tremors, but it's really about when we go into a state of extreme fear, or some people talk about that freeze state, we actually go into specific body patterns. And Dr. David Berceli's work was really formed in working in war-torn countries. He worked quite a bit with Mother Teresa and had his own experiences. And then he also had some experiences with work in somatics. And in somatics, they talk about kind of the red light reflex, if you will, where and for David, he didn't ever call it that, but he said, he was in a building with, 10 people from 6 different countries. And when bombs would go off, and I think it was in Lebanon, people would just curl up, right? It's the acoustic startle full blown. I mean, that's how I knew it, but he would say they just curled up in this fetal curl, but we all do some element of that. If somebody says something to you that's really shocking you create tension in the center of your body. If it's life-threatening, you will shrink your whole body down. Anything that's vulnerable, your eyes will blink and close. You'll close off your throat. You'll take your rib cage, put it over your pelvis to protect your gut. You'll pull your legs together. And so it actually creates a tension pattern starting in a really key kind of fascial line, if you will. You can look at it from multiple perspectives. It's a reflex. It's a withdrawal reflex that, and this is what I've studied because that's what I was interested in. David doesn't really talk about it that way, but starts really early. But David saw the pattern. And he was like, and he was learning the work of like all of us in the world of trauma and how trauma is in the body. And so he created, his idea was, trauma is universal. And that we need to, and many people aren't going to have access to high level professionals that cost money. And he was working in really poverty-stricken areas. And he wanted to create a set of exercises that would release the trauma. And so he basically created a set of 7, 8 exercises. I'll get the numbers wrong. That's my dyslexia, but a movement sequence where you either stretch or tire the muscles from the bottom of your feet all the way through the core of your body up through your jaw, basically. But a key muscle would be the psoas, which is the muscle that's going to fold you over. Mm-hmm. And it's very primitive. It's very deep in the body. It's not something you can feel tension in your shoulders. You aren't necessarily going to feel tension in your psoas. It's an interesting muscle in a lot of ways. But anyway, doing that work was really powerful, and I wanted to take it to the kids. And I think for me, I ended up doing more of it with parents and my teens. So my young man that was doing some of the cutting, I had done TRE with him. That was where it was really more fitting. But in the younger kids, it's a little bit harder to do. And then I really started to look at, in my work, so taking David's work back into a developmental perspective, looking at the basic, we are wired with a set of defensive patterns. And that's where you create and you can create tension in the gut, but you also can create tension in the back and the limbs, and just looking now. So I think in my work, I look at kids and where are the tension patterns, and then working with different activities to release that. And it's really taking David's work and adapting it to a broader developmental picture, but it doesn't really look much like David's work anymore. So I don't know if that's an influence or whatever, but I was very influenced by that. And so looking at how do you release tension in the body in a playful way, as a part of like preparation. Like if I'm going to work with somebody and you're holding tension, wherever you hold tension in the body, we know you don't feel. I need you to feel your body if you want to be able to use your body in a competent way and be able to do the things you want to do as a child. Also very tied up. All of that is very tied up with our physiology and our ability to feel safe in the world. All of it is very tied up with the breath and overall regulation. So I just took it back into a broader picture. It's kind of all of my work is about diving into all the details of something and then coming back and figuring out how I can do it with kids. I would say that I still use that. And one of the ways I see a lot of OTs adapting it is using it with parents, because we know that parents that are all parents, but, particularly if you are fostering a child or you have a child who has additional needs on top of the complexities of what it takes to raise a child in this world, that there's a lot of stress. So I know a lot of OTs that are looking at that. A particular OT, I think on the East Coast is starting a study to look at parents and co-regulation by helping the parents use TRE for regulation. I did have a father and a son that I did TRE with separately, a teenager and a father that really was great in supporting the connection in their relationship and doing it as a kind of a prep for that. They didn't do it together. They did it separately, but that it really helped. So I think that I'm just trying to find ways to do that. And it's kind of how I stumbled on balance challenges, that we like to create balance challenges sometimes where it activates, and you sometimes will see in the kids like a little shimmer or a shake, which is as adults and you're doing TRE, and people can go online and look up David doing TRE with adults on Zoom, et cetera, but you'll see their whole body can be shaking. But in kids, I often see these, like I might see it in a limb, I might see it up the spine, as a way of me knowing that we got in there and we kind of released some tension. But I also think of it as bringing on awareness, because one of the things that we know about the fetus, when they actually are connecting to the muscles and the sense of proprioception, the sense of muscle contraction and joint awareness, that there's a tremor. So, and I often see, well, what are the things that, and it's not a tremor that is a clinical problem. It's just a shake and it goes away. It's not anything like a clinical sign of a neurological issue. So that word, that's why David talked about trauma, and he moved away from that tremoring into more shaking kinds of things. But I'll often see that with kids where it's almost like I love this word, remember a limb. Or in some of my kids, they become aware of it for the first time. So in some of the adaptions that I've done, but I've also seen it in just regular sensory integration. I had a little one that I was working with the other day who was born early, which is, we now kind of know, not from Ayer's work, but from other people's work, that has an impact on the cerebellum, which is a big modulator of our nervous system emotionally, but also motor regulation, and, tying together information from the vestibular sense and the proprioceptive sense, and who was having some movement challenges and being a little one, a 2-year-old, being fearful, didn't have the greatest motor control. And again, we did some work, heavy vestibular input, and we were using some rotation, and you could see, and she was loving it. And she was laying on her side on a rotary board. You could see the little tremor go down her arms. And then after she came off the board and started to play, she didn't have good protective reactions where your arms would automatically go out. And after there was something she did that challenged her balance backwards, and her arms immediately came out and protected her. And I was like, yes, she remembered her arms. And she connected them for the first time. And then somewhere in that prematurity, she was also, she's 2 now, born in the height of the pandemic. So, so to me, and that's just a little thing, but it's not a little thing, because that then can translate back to confidence that I can do it, the agency. Kids need that to be able to, obviously we all know that, especially a lot of your listeners who are coming more from that mental health perspective.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just shared. And one of the takeaways that I'm hearing is that the work with the parents and the caregivers, the adults, is so important to how then they can show up relationally for their children. And, even as you were demonstrating the way your body was contracting, I felt my body contracting because if you have a child that's in these defensive patterns, the parent and the caregiver, their body is also going to respond to that. And then they've got their own history and their own stories that we're all walking around with. So the more we can do to help the adults release and heal, then the more we're going to be able to do so that they can then show up to help co-regulate and strengthen those attachment relationships, which are at the core of all the work that we're doing. So I appreciate all that you shared. And I know the time is, of course, flying by because that's what happens when we're talking about all this beautiful information. So I want our listeners to be able to know more about what you're doing and working on, and your website is just full of resources. So would love for you to share more about that.
Okay. Well, and I think my continued work, and I've talked to you a lot about the vestibular, but one of the biggest changes that I had in my life around vestibular came from me using sound. And so I ended up being a big player in creating a sound tool that would be, at the time when we were working, the only way for you to be able to be introduced to sound was by being in a clinic for 2 weeks, at least at a time, and spending, at least minimum $1,000. Some people were charging a lot more. And so what I'm probably the most known for in the OT world is linking sound to sensory integration. But in my own personal journey, it was when I used sound that was modified, that I actually got over my gravitational insecurity. Like I literally was jumping off of heights and being like, look at me, look what I can do. I went back to where I picked up where I was for, and it made a big difference in my organization and my attention and the ability to do my work, that it was kind of mind blowing. And then it was really my husband who said, we have to do this. We have to make this available in the world. I know now there's many listening programs out there, but we really were among the first to take it into OT and sensory integration and to combine it with movement in what's called therapeutic listening. So we're always doing that in an ongoing way and trying to figure out how to have others learn about how critical sound is in the sensory integrative process, but also another big piece is in the process of regulating physiological arousal and affect. And so we teach a number of courses on that. So therapeutic listening would be the bedrock of where we started. But, it's a challenge in different environments, different settings, for individuals to be able to. That program requires daily listening, but we created another program called Quick Shifts, which uses a binaural beat kind of technology that takes you into the alpha range, which is really smack dab in the middle of the arousal curve. And it is also mindfulness. But one of the things that's unique about our program is that we look at the music specifically, and sort of, for us, the music matters. And we have a lot of music that addresses the vestibular system through rhythm and having a little bit more weighting toward the bottom end. We now know that this is why I changed so much in my gravitational insecurity when I use sound, is that I was listening to things that had more of a rock pop beat in the training protocol that I was using at the time. And that we now know that a part of the vestibular system, one of the gravity receptors, responds to that low frequency. And that we also now know that you do not process a rhythm and feel unless you move your head, that it has a vestibular element. So we capitalized on a lot of that in our work. And so quick shifts are a tool people can use. We don't typically throw them out there for public use. There's a quick free webinar on our website around quick shifts. We use them a lot in trauma, developmental trauma, in home programming, in classroom programming. So that's like kind of where I started, but it was really that I was interested in auditory, but really what we know is there's the vestibular system. If you just look anywhere to try to define it and understand it, you're going to see it's one with the auditory system. So we talked in the beginning about body and space, but you don't have a separate body and a separate perception of space. It's seamless. And the vestibular system is the bridge. And that goes into the higher level auditory processing of the space that surrounds you. And that you really need to have a clear sense of you, and you need to have a clear sense of the space that surrounds you. But I was thinking, I had an experience this morning where I put my earpods in and I was going to listen to a podcast while I was out walking the dog. And my podcast wasn't working on my iPhone. And so I was walking for a little while. I'm like, why is this experience not as pleasant as it usually is for me to take a little walk in the nature realm? But I took out my earpods. The space, like you don't realize how much the space that surrounds you, especially if it's a pleasant naturescape or whatever, really helps you to relax and go into really mindfulness. And then also clearly knowing if there were danger, exactly where it is in relationship to you. And that's not all from the vestibular system, it's through vestibular talking to the auditory. And so that's how I got into the auditory. So that's like an ongoing awareness that we've tried to keep in it. You'll see even when we're doing other teaching, we always bring in sound because it's really primary. It's one of the first ways that you know danger and safety. So yes, safety in the human voice in a prosodic way versus a human voice that's getting nervous, right? And gets into a narrow range or a screech. I mean, those are all things that the baby comes wired to. You're also develop in that first really 6 months of life as you come up against gravity, a sense, and you're getting that clearer sense of where you are, first year, 2 years of life and mastering gravity to walk and challenge it. You are also getting a clearer sense of the space that surrounds you, just in this sort of low-lying auditory image, like a low-lying visual image. Like you'd walk in a room and get a sense of it visually by looking. You do the same thing with your ears. But the difference with the ears is that it's three-dimensional. It's not just what's in front of you or what you capture with your periphery. So it really leads to feeling safe. And it feeds into the whole sensory integrative process because we are a body in a space always, unless you go into a sound vacuum. And one of the sound engineers I worked with told me once he's like, I did that. He said, and guess what? I fell over. I'm like, yeah, because you don't realize how much you take in the surrounding space. So that's an ongoing process. We teach other things. I've had a lot of broad interest in the overall. Basically, I'll study something in, the world. And then I always bring it back to sensory integration and take that body-based perspective. And that's really what happened with trauma. So I do some trauma-informed workshops online, also more if, a longer version of that and people invite me personally. So that's kind of an ongoing process. And people could find that on the website. There's something not on the website yet that's really coming up. Something I'm very interested in is teaching this body-based sensory integrative piece in a way that's really practical and usable, that includes like assessment, but more what observations do you make? How do you draw information together to put with the rest of your assessment and then monitor that ongoing in the moment, called Ready, Steady, Go. And it's really about how that process of becoming regulated, if you will, if you want to use that word, or, your physiological arousal, your affect regulation, being balanced toward positive or negative. But it's really looking at that from how the sensory integrative process affects it. And then what are little power-up tools that you can use to find the balance again? But that's how that ties together with having a body, knowing you have a body and that it's stable. That's the steady part of it. And then activities that can be very much done in a therapy clinic, but then what are little to-goes for a classroom or home programming, or how do we use that? And maybe we do something in the clinic, but what do we send home? And then into go, which is, being functional in three-dimensional dynamic space, but not just the physical space, but the emotional space, because all of those things keep cycling together and affecting each other, and how to take that perspective, which is basically a sensory integrative perspective, but we try to lay it out in a practical, how do you clinically reason, and in a way that is fitting with other models. So we're really following the brain science on that and the research, so that we're not just making something up, so that it fits. You could fit it really nicely with, a neurorelational model, or with a floor time model, with a DDP model, or, when I think about some of the stuff with TheraPlay, all of that can fit right into that. It isn't exclusive. It's kind of my way of helping younger clinicians and experienced clinicians, depending on your perspective, to have this broad map from which to operate moment to moment, but also to keep taking in the big picture. And then if I get successes in the moment to moment, knowing what that's going to lead to if I put it into the classroom or I put it into home programming. So it's a tall order, and we've been working really hard on it. So we're doing our first one in New York. No, I'm doing the first one in Australia, I think in October, and then in New York City in September. So
sign me up. It sounds like a dream training. I would love to go. And I love that you are open to multidisciplines attending the training. So it's not exclusive to OTs, but other disciplines are also welcome, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Jenna, you'd be more than welcome there. It would be really fun. Come to New York. We'll have fun.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
I know. Dinner and,
and to also give our listeners, because there was a lot of that interspersed throughout our conversation, but if there were just a few more just kind of practical tips, and I know it's not a one size fits all, but just some practical tips that they could think about implementing in their work or parenting.
Well, I think the first one we started with is like really just one, you brought out the delighting in, and I love that, but also then we're hyper focused on what's not possible for parents and the problems, but focus on what's possible and what in the moment is on the verge of changing. And play and risk are, how can you create a risk that child can master? And it's a risk about kind of, Eris talked about the just right challenge. Is it that they, this is an activity from TheraPlay, but they stand on one pillow and they jump off and then two? Is it that, or do they do some minuscule little challenge that, is it the curb? Is it whatever? Are you walking in the woods? Can they stand up on that limb that has fallen off the tree? And just what are the things you can go on to challenge your balance? Because that takes you in the moment, and it also provides that sense of I can do it. So little kids playing with falling, adults playing with falling and getting back up and taking a challenge. And we do a lot of that in a multitude of ways. Adults, if you can do a slack line, go for it, creating just whatever you can find to balance on, and is going to be, I think, a really key piece. Also, that would be one of the big things that I learned to facilitate the vestibular system. Also, movement. One of the things we use all the time is rolling. There's a million different ways that you can roll on the floor and games you can play. And you can roll over, and you want to think about that's going to really get into some of the vestibular piece and changing head position as much as possible. So when to stimulate the vestibular system, we move, but we always, if you look at most movement, it's with the head in the upright. So getting the head out of the upright. It's why, yoga and those things. But if I would prefer yoga with kids to be fast moving, because that's really what kids do, so thinking about movement and movement challenges, but in unique settings, and in the play, and then in partnership, in relationships, not just, go, all right, we'll see you later, go out on the trampoline, go do your sensory diet. No, in playful ways where there's moment to moment changes that you have to keep responding to. And I think one of the things that we now know is adults need to play. So go back and play and forget, from a parent perspective, that you've got to pick up that thing at 3:00, maybe pick it up at 3, but set a timer and then let it go and really do some fun, playful things. Are you going to take a sleeping bag down the stairs? What are you going to do? We do a game of sock wrestling. Are you going to find, your gym ball that you use for your Pilates routine? Can you play with that in another way and see what ideas the kids come up with? It's that freedom to choose, but also not letting it go awry. You have to introduce an idea as well. So I think play with a lot of movement and a lot of body input is critically important. Those are things you can do right away in relationship to a child. And also, I think the thing that you probably have people talk about all the time is take care of your own self first. You have to manage yourself. And whether you call it your spiritual journey or you call it your therapy session, we all need to, and I just see this at my age, just keep digging into what do I feel in this moment and being with it so that I can be with another. And whatever it is it journaling? Is it your coffee with a friend? Whatever takes you to that place of being present with yourself and what's going on for you and being able to hold it in your own space, so that you can join in with another in a way where you can be present, even if you're having a hard day. And I find sometimes I get out of a session with a kid and a parent and, the whole thing. And I think I should be paying them. I don't really want to tell them that because this is my livelihood. But,
Yes.
that was like, because when you can get lost in it, it's so therapeutic for everyone.
Yeah, because that means you're present. And that's one of the most powerful gifts that a parent can give, that a therapist, clinician can give. So this was great advice and takeaways. And we recently started a Attachment Theory in Action podcast network Facebook group that I told our Facebook community that we were going to be interviewing you and asked if they had any questions and got a couple great questions. Anne asked, what do you love about being an OT? I think that's already come out so beautifully in our interview. And then Joan asked, what's changed in the history? Like, what did we used to think about sensory processing versus what do we know now? And I think you've really touched on that too. And what's really exciting is that you're also part of that evolution in the work that you're doing. And we can hear so much of that, the way you have this passion and gift for understanding the vestibular and auditory systems, but how that all works holistically too, and how that also has to be done in relationship and in creating safety in these play opportunities. And these, the body's ability to release these tension and trauma patterns, all of it. It's so beautiful, which is why we could keep going on forever and ever. But we do have to wrap up. So we'll make sure that your website is linked, where there's lots of resources and people can learn more about these upcoming trainings. And I can't wait for us to have continued conversations. I know you're trying to slow down and work towards retirement. So, but you're still going to be working, right?
Yeah, I'm still going to work. Retirement for me is going to look like everybody else's sort of maybe job that they do. I don't know. I'm probably still working, at least 30 hours a week, or, on some weeks 20 and some weeks 10 and some weeks still 40 and 45, but just trying to take a back seat. A lot of it for me is going to be about turning over some things that I do that aren't the creating and aren't the teaching pieces, because that's what takes a lot of energy, following up on details and things, because I do run a continuing education business and I'd like to have that taken over. And I'm in process of doing that. So that I can just teach and do just pure passion. I think after 42 years of doing all the other things, I think that's okay. That's a great retirement for me. It's like my garden. If somebody else would do the garden, this is my garden. Like, I want to just stay in the garden. So, and, continue to support anyone who's interested in supporting others, really is the mission I think that we're all on, because it's in that I find my most joy. And
Yes.
And I think the world needs it. We didn't even get into that.
Well, we can always have you back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. That would be awesome. Jenna, I so enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, me too. And thank you for all your contributions and the work that you're doing. It's so needed. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'd be happy to have you back and keep learning from you as always. Thank you so much, Sheila.
That's great. Thank you, Jenna. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.